in late 1967, a Viet Cong tracker named Locke was given a simple order. He was told it would take him an afternoon. Find the patrol that had killed 3 men from his unit 2 nights earlier and find where it had gone. It took him 5 days. He never found it. He found where it had been. A single boot print in soft ground, half erased by rain the patrol had walked through on purpose. A patch of grass bent the wrong way, and then, 20 meters on, bent back the right way as though someone had deliberately confused the sign before moving off in a different direction entirely. He found a resting place, cold, with nothing left behind. Not a wrapper, not a cigarette, and not a single sign that 5 men had lain there for an hour. He was one of the best trackers his unit had. He had followed Americans before easily, sometimes from the sound of their boots alone. He could not follow this. Locke's commanders had a name for the patrols that did this to their trackers. It had started as a frightened joke. Within a year, it had become a term used in serious briefings, with no joke left in it at all. Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle. Locke could not know the names of the 5 men who had killed his comrades and vanished. He did not know they were Australian, part of a tiny unit that numbered only a few dozen men in his entire province at any given time, dwarfed by the hundreds of thousands of Americans fighting the same war a few kilometers away. He knew only that his own jungle, the ground he had walked his whole life, had somehow given up nothing at all. That is the story of why an army fighting the most powerful military machine on earth came to fear a few dozen quiet men more than anyone else in that war. Now let me show you what made them so impossible to find. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why a handful of Australians frightened the Viet Cong more than the enormous American war machine next door, you first have to understand exactly what these men did differently. And you have to understand where they learned to do it. To understand why the Viet Cong could not track these patrols, you have to understand that this was not a skill invented for Vietnam. It was a skill carried into Vietnam, already refined over years of a different jungle war fought a decade earlier. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment traced its lineage back through the British SAS and through years spent alongside British forces during the long counterinsurgency fought against communist guerrillas in the jungles of Malaya. That campaign had taught brutal, patient lessons about jungle warfare that had nothing to do with firepower and everything to do with movement, patience, and the discipline of leaving no trace. The men who eventually formed the Australian SASR carried those lessons forward. They refined them and built an entire training program around a single, uncompromising standard. If the enemy can see you, hear you, or find where you have been, you have already failed at your job. Picture the actual handoff of that knowledge, because it did not arrive as a manual. It arrived as men, instructors who had themselves crawled through Malayan jungle a decade earlier, teaching young Australian troopers the same lessons that had once been drilled into them. A veteran of that earlier campaign might spend an entire afternoon correcting a single trainee's foot placement over and over until the movement stopped being a conscious choice and became instinct. There was no shortcut offered and no allowance made for talent alone. A naturally quiet man who had not put in the hours was considered more dangerous to a patrol than a clumsy man who had, because the jungle did not forgive confidence that had not been earned through repetition. This produced a unit built almost entirely around reconnaissance rather than firepower. An infantry company measured its effectiveness partly by the weight of fire it could bring to bear. The SASR measured itself by something almost the opposite. It measured how completely it could move through hostile territory while remaining, to every sense the enemy possessed, simply absent. Patrols were kept deliberately small, typically around 5 men, because a small patrol left a small signature. That small signature was the entire foundation of everything else these men did. Every other advantage flowed from that first disciplined choice. The training to achieve this was exacting almost beyond belief. Men were taught to place each foot deliberately, testing the ground before committing their weight, so that a twig did not snap and a stone did not shift. They were taught to move so slowly, hour after hour, that covering even a modest distance could consume an entire day. They were taught to eliminate scent as much as possible. They buried or carried out anything that might mark their passage. They chose rest positions with escape routes already planned before anyone sat down. None of this looked heroic in the way a firefight looked heroic. It looked from the outside almost absurdly patient, grown men creeping meter by meter through undergrowth, taking hours to cross ground an ordinary patrol would cover in minutes. Picture what a single day of this training actually demanded of a man's body and nerve. An hour to cross what should have taken 5 minutes. Every muscle held under tension, moving in slow, deliberate stages because a sudden movement was as dangerous as a loud one. A mind that had to stay alert to sound, scent, and sign simultaneously for hours on end, with no relief and no room for the small mental lapses that ordinary fatigue produces in every other kind of soldiering. Men who trained for this said afterward that it was harder in its own way than combat itself, because combat at least resolved. This never fully did. The discipline had to hold every single minute, because a single lapse could undo hours of perfect silence in an instant. And that patience was the entire point. The SASR's core mission in Vietnam was not to fight. It was to see without being seen. It was to know the ground and the enemy's movements so completely that the intelligence they gathered became, in the words later used to describe them, the eyes and the ears of the entire Australian task force. A 5-man patrol that fought was, in an important sense, a patrol that had already failed at its primary job. Contact meant exposure, and exposure meant the enemy now knew for certain that Australians were operating in that ground. The whole discipline of the unit was built to make that exposure as rare as humanly possible. Now return to Locke kneeling in the jungle with nothing to track, and understand exactly what he was up against. His failure was not a failure of skill. It was a failure to find any of the things a skilled tracker needed in order to succeed at all. A tracker's entire craft depends on reading the accumulated evidence of another human being's passage through the world. Disturbed vegetation, displaced soil, the specific, learnable signature of how a boot compresses ground differently from a bare foot, how a heavy man's stride differs from a light one, how fresh sign differs from sign a day or a week old. Locke had built a career on reading exactly this kind of evidence, and against most enemies, in most terrain, it worked. American units, moving in larger numbers, carrying heavier loads, generally left sign that a good tracker could follow for hours or days. The Australian patrols left almost nothing to read. Every man had been trained to place his feet where the man ahead of him had placed his, so that 5 sets of footprints collapsed, as much as possible, into what looked like the passage of one. They moved off game trails deliberately, choosing harder ground that held less sign, even when it cost them time and effort that softer ground would have saved. When they had to cross open or exposed terrain, they moved in ways specifically designed to break a track rather than extend it, doubling back, wading through water that left nothing behind, deliberately obscuring the very sign a tracker like Locke would need to follow them. Picture the actual work of following a track that has been deliberately broken, because it is a special and demoralizing kind of failure. Locke finds sign, follows it confidently for 100 meters, and then it simply stops at a stream or a stretch of bare rock with no clear continuation on the far side in any direction. He has to circle, wide, searching for where the trail resumes, burning hours on a single break in the sign. Sometimes he finds it. Sometimes the patrol has doubled back through its own earlier trail on purpose, specifically to send a tracker circling in the wrong direction. Bersabe, the time Locke realizes his mistake, whatever lead he had, is gone, spent chasing a false trail laid by men who understood exactly how a tracker's mind worked. And they vanished from places the same way they moved through them. A patrol that had occupied a position for hours left it before departing exactly as it had found it. No litter, no disturbed ground, beyond what was unavoidable, nothing that told a search team afterward how many men had been there, how long, or which direction they had gone. This was not incidental caution. It was drilled, deliberate procedure, practiced until it became as automatic as breathing. The men who did this understood, better than almost anyone else in that war, that the difference between disappearing completely and leaving one small trace was often the difference between completing a patrol and not surviving it. Think about what this meant for a man like Locke, professionally and personally. His skill, honed over years, depended on an assumption so basic he had probably never had to articulate it, that people moving through terrain leave evidence of having done so. The Australians broke that assumption so completely that his failure to find them was not a mark against his competence. It was proof that he was hunting something specifically, expertly trained to give a tracker nothing at all to work with. Picture the conversation he had to have when he finally returned, empty-handed, on the 5th day. A commander who had expected a location or at least a direction, receiving instead a report built entirely out of negatives. No trail beyond the 2nd day, no campsite, no confirmed direction of withdrawal. In any other circumstance, a tracker delivering that kind of report after 5 days would have been questioned closely about his own competence, and Locke braced for exactly that. What he got instead was a kind of grim, weary nod, because his commander had heard versions of this same report before from other trackers about the same handful of patrols. The report was not evidence of Locke's failure. It had become, by that point in the war, its own kind of confirmation, the recognizable shape of an encounter with the Phantoms, told the only way it could be told in the specific, frustrating language of absence. The stealth alone would have made these patrols hard to find. What made them genuinely feared was what that stealth allowed them to do once they had found the enemy instead. A patrol that moved slowly enough and quietly enough to remain undetected for days at a time gained an extraordinary advantage. It could watch, it could observe an enemy camp or a supply route, or a unit's movements for hours or days. This gathered exact and current intelligence that no aerial reconnaissance and no captured document could match, because it came from men who had actually been there, close enough to count and confirm without the enemy ever knowing they had been watched at all. This intelligence fed directly into the broader Australian task force's operations. It shaped where conventional forces went and what they found when they arrived, which is why these patrols came to be described as the eyes and ears of the entire Australian effort in the province. Picture a patrol lying in observation for 2 full days on a suspected supply route, doing nothing more dramatic than watching and recording. Men moving in shifts to eat, to rest, to relieve themselves, all without leaving the position, all without making a sound that might carry to the trail 30 meters away. They count porters. They note the direction of movement, the apparent weight of loads, the time of day traffic tends to move, the presence or absence of armed escort. None of this looks like war in any conventional sense. It looks like an enormous, patient act of accounting conducted under conditions that would break most men within hours. And then, once the observation window closed, the patrol withdrew exactly as carefully as it had arrived, carrying 2 days of precise, current intelligence back to a headquarters that could now plan an ambush, an airstrike, or simply a redirection of resources with a level of accuracy no other source in that province could match. And when a patrol did choose to fight, rather than simply observe and withdraw, the same patience that had kept it hidden now worked as a weapon in its own right. These were not men stumbling into chance contact. A firefight initiated by an Australian patrol was more often than any side would have preferred to admit, a firefight the patrol had chosen, timed, positioned, and sprung on terms entirely of its own choosing against an enemy who had no idea anyone was there until the shooting had already started. The element of total surprise, purchased by days of disciplined silence, turned a 5-man patrol into a force capable of inflicting damage wildly disproportionate to its size. Picture the actual moment of contact from the enemy's side, because it is the payoff of everything described so far. A group of Viet Cong moving along a trail they have used many times at ease, talking quietly among themselves with no reason to believe anyone is nearby. They do not hear anything because there is nothing to hear. They do not see anything because the patrol watching them has spent the last several hours in cover so complete it might as well not exist. And then, without warning, the ambush opens. 5 men firing from prepared positions at close range against a completely unaware target produce an effect utterly out of proportion to their number. It is over in seconds, and the patrol is already moving, before the survivors, if there are any, can fully process what has just happened to them. This is reflected plainly in the results these patrols produced over the years they operated in Vietnam, across nearly 1,200 patrols conducted by the Australian and New Zealand SAS between 1966 and 1971. The unit inflicted several hundred confirmed enemy casualties. That record stood, by the official assessment of the Australian War Memorial, as the highest kill ratio of any Australian unit that served in that war. And it did this while suffering remarkably few losses of its own. Across that entire 6-year campaign, the unit's own combat deaths from enemy action numbered only a handful, a figure that becomes almost startling once you set it beside the scale and duration of the operations these men carried out deep in contested territory for years on end. That imbalance, enormous damage inflicted, and almost none absorbed in return is the clearest possible evidence of what the stealth was actually for. It was never simply about avoiding a fight. It was about controlling, almost completely, the terms on which a fight happened at all. When, where, against whom, and with the crucial advantage of total surprise on the patrol side and none whatsoever on the enemy's. Picture, too, what happened in the minutes immediately after a chosen contact, because the discipline that mattered before the ambush mattered just as much after it. A patrol that had just sprung a devastating ambush did not linger to assess the damage or celebrate the result. It broke contact immediately, following a rehearsed withdrawal, moving fast toward a pre-planned extraction point, while any survivors of the ambush were still too stunned to organize pursuit. Radio silence was broken only for the essential call requesting extraction, kept as brief as the earlier silence had been total. Within minutes, the same 5 men who had just inflicted heavy casualties on an unsuspecting enemy were airborne, already gone, leaving behind a scene the enemy would spend hours trying to make sense of, with no trail left to explain how it had happened or where the attackers had gone. Here's the part of this story that deserves real attention, because it explains why a unit this small produced fear this large, out of all apparent proportion to its size. At any given time, the SASR presence in Vietnam numbered only a few dozen men actually in the field, a genuinely tiny fraction of the hundreds of thousands of American and Allied troops operating in the country. By any ordinary military logic, a force this small should have registered as a minor irritant against an enemy fighting a war of that scale. Instead, accounts from Viet Cong units operating in Puoc Toi and the surrounding provinces describe something different. They describe a dread of these patrols that outweighed in the daily experience of soldiers on the ground, the fear of far larger and more heavily armed American formations operating nearby. The reason lies in the specific psychology of an enemy you cannot detect. A large American sweep, however dangerous, followed a logic the Viet Cong understood and could plan around. It was loud. It was visible from a distance. It gave warning, however brief, and warning meant the possibility of escape, of avoiding contact entirely, of choosing not to be present when the danger arrived. An enemy of that kind, however powerful, was a known quantity, and known quantities, however frightening, could be managed with caution and good intelligence. An enemy that gave no warning at all was a different category of fear entirely. If Australian patrols might already be watching any given position at any given moment, with no sound and no sign to betray their presence, then the ordinary calculus of risk simply stopped working. You could not choose to avoid contact with a threat you could not detect in the first place. Every quiet stretch of jungle carried the possibility that it was not empty at all. There was no way to know and no way to check, short of the contact itself, which by definition arrived without warning at a moment and place the patrol alone had chosen. Think about what that uncertainty did to ordinary daily life for a Viet Cong unit operating in that province. Cooking fires, once routine, became a calculated risk because smoke could be seen and reported by a patrol nobody knew was watching. Conversations, once relaxed, grew quieter because a voice carried and nobody could say for certain who might be within earshot. Trails that had been walked casually for years were now walked with a new and constant wariness because a trail was exactly the kind of place a patient patrol chose to wait. The fear did not require an actual sighting to do its work. The mere possibility, sustained day after day with no way to resolve it, was enough to change how an entire unit lived. Consider what a single confirmed sighting of a patrol, even a failed one, could do to that pattern of fear across an entire district. Word would travel, unit to unit, the way any critical survival information traveled fast among men whose lives depended on it. And the story would grow a little with each retelling, the way stories always do, until a single five-man patrol became, in the imagination of men who had never actually seen it, an omnipresent threat lurking in every stretch of quiet jungle for kilometers around. Commanders had to weigh that psychological cost against operational necessity, sometimes delaying or rerouting movements simply because morale in a unit that believed itself watched could collapse faster than any tactical setback could cause on its own. The Australians never needed to be everywhere. They needed only to convince the enemy that they might be, and the enemy's own imagination did the rest of the work for them. This is why the nickname that emerged was not simply a name for a dangerous enemy. It reached for something closer to the supernatural, because the ordinary vocabulary of military threat did not capture what these men actually represented. A dangerous enemy can be avoided with good information and careful movement. A phantom cannot, because a phantom, by definition, gives you nothing to act on until it is already too late. That is not a rational fear born of statistics, though the statistics themselves were genuinely alarming. It is a much older and more primal kind of fear, the fear of an unseen hunter in a place you had always considered your own. It spread through the ranks of an enemy who understood, correctly, that in this specific and narrow sense, the jungle they had always trusted to hide them no longer belonged to them at all. It would be easy, and it would be a disservice to the honest history this channel tries to tell, to leave the story as a simple tale of Australian supremacy in the jungle. The record itself resists that simple A reading if you look closely enough. The extraordinary results the SASR achieved were made possible by a scale of commitment that was, by design, narrow and specific. A few dozen men, superbly trained, operating with total institutional support to do one thing exceptionally well, are not a model that could have been scaled up to fight the entire war. The vast bulk of the fighting and the vast bulk of the dying on the Australian and American sides alike was done by conventional infantry, fighting in larger, noisier, less concealed formations, because that scale of force was what the wider war actually required. The SASR's achievement was real and remarkable, but it was achieved inside a role that, by its very nature, could never have been the whole answer to a war of that size. And the enemy, over time, adapted, the way any capable adversary adapts to a persistent threat. By the later years of the Siouxsie, SASR's deployment, accounts describe Viet Cong units in Phuoc Tho growing more familiar with Australian insertion patterns. They occasionally engaged patrols shortly after they had been dropped into an area, a sign that the element of total surprise, while never fully lost, had at least been narrowed by years of hard-won enemy experience. Picture what that adaptation actually looked like on the ground for the VC units that achieved it. Observers were posted near likely landing zones, patient in exactly the way the Australians themselves had trained to be patient, watching the sky for the specific sound and shape of an insertion helicopter, rather than waiting to stumble onto a patrol already dispersed and hidden. This was the enemy learning to fight fire with fire, adopting a version of the same discipline that had defeated their trackers for years, applied now to the one moment in a patrol's life when it was briefly at its most vulnerable, the seconds after touching down before the patrol had dispersed into the cover that made it disappear. That a portion of the enemy learned to exploit exactly this narrow window is itself the clearest evidence that the Viet Cong were never passive victims of an unstoppable phantom, but a capable and adaptive force that eventually found the one seam in an otherwise nearly seamless discipline. The Australians responded with further refinements to their own methods, including deliberately deceptive insertion techniques designed to defeat exactly this kind of adaptation. Picture how one such technique actually worked, because it shows how far this contest of adaptation went. A helicopter carrying a patrol would be followed closely by a second aircraft carrying another patrol. Both would land together, travel together briefly, and then one patrol would peel off and continue alone, while the other doubled back toward the base. To an enemy watching the skies, two insertions had happened where only one mattered, and there was no way to know which patrol was the real threat and which had already left. It was a small piece of theater built specifically to defeat an enemy who had grown as patient watching the sky as the Australians had once been watching the ground. That back and forth refinement, answered by counter refinement, is itself proof that this was never a story of an unbeatable phantom force facing a helpless enemy. It was a story of two sides, both capable, locked in a long and evolving contest over an advantage that neither side ever fully owned for the whole of the war. The honest picture, then, holds two things together at once. The SASR's stealth and discipline produced results that were, by any measure, extraordinary, and the fear they inspired in the Viet Cong was real, well-documented, and entirely rational, given what these patrols actually did. And that achievement was narrow by design, dependent on a role and a scale that could never have been the model for the whole war, fought against an enemy who, given years to study it, began finding ways to narrow the advantage rather than simply submit to it forever. Locke never did find the patrol that killed his comrades. In the years afterward, he thought often about what those 5 lost days in the jungle had actually taught him. He came to understand eventually that his failure had not been a failure of skill in the way he first assumed. He was a good tracker, and he remained one for the rest of the war, successfully following countless other units through countless other patches of jungle. What he had encountered that week was not a test he had failed. It was an opponent who had trained for years specifically to defeat every tool a tracker like him possessed. He had not lost a contest of skill. He had run into the deliberate, engineered absence of anything a contest of skill could be fought over. He thought, too, about what it had done to his own sense of the ground he had spent his whole life on. He had known that jungle since he was a boy, its trails, its water, its rhythms. He had trusted, in some deep and unexamined way, that this knowledge made the terrain his, in a sense the enemy could never fully claim. The Australians had not taken that knowledge away from him. They had done something stranger. They had shown him that knowing the ground intimately was no longer enough, because the thing hunting him no longer needed to interact with the ground in any way his knowledge could detect. That was a harder thing to accept than a simple defeat, and it stayed with him longer. He remembered specifically teaching younger trackers in the years afterward, and how difficult it was to explain what had happened to him without sounding as though he were making excuses. He found himself falling back more than once on the same language his commanders had used. Phantoms, ghosts, not because he believed in anything supernatural, but because it was the only vocabulary available that came close to describing an enemy who left him nothing at all to work with. He wanted the younger men to understand that this was not carelessness on their part if it happened to them too. It was simply what happened when you were hunting men who had trained for years to make sure you never could. And he came, eventually, to a grudging and complicated respect for the patrols that had done this to him, the same respect we have seen other men in this series extend to enemies who mastered something genuinely difficult. He did not know their names, and he never would, but he understood, better than most, exactly what it had taken to move through hostile jungle for days at a time, leaving nothing behind, trusting entirely in discipline and patience where every instinct might have screamed for speed instead. He had spent his life reading the signs other men left behind. The patrol that beat him had spent years learning to leave none, and he respected, even as he feared it, the sheer, uncompromising discipline that achievement had required. Decades later, long after the war, he told the story to his own grandchildren, and he found himself softening it in ways he had not expected. He described the patience more than the fear. He talked about what it must have taken those 5 men, whoever they were, to move that slowly for that long, trusting their training completely in a jungle that was not their own, thousands of kilometers from anywhere they called home. He had spent much of his life resenting what those patrols had cost his side. By the end of it, what he mostly felt when he let himself remember clearly was something closer to professional awe, the particular respect one craftsman eventually learns to offer another, even one who had, on that single terrible week, beaten him completely. Here is what Locke finally understood about the phantoms he could never find and why they frightened his side more than an army 500 times their size. Fear, in most wars, scales roughly with force. A bigger army, a heavier weapon, a wider front produces a correspondingly larger dread in the men facing it because the danger is visible, measurable, and roughly proportional to what can be seen coming. The Australian SAS broke that proportion completely. A few dozen men in a war fought by hundreds of thousands produced a fear that outran their numbers by a margin no ordinary military logic can explain. The reason is that they were never fighting inside the ordinary categories of danger at all. They had removed themselves from the register of things that could be seen coming. An enemy who cannot be seen coming cannot be planned against, however careful and however experienced the men trying to plan against him happen to be. That is the real meaning behind the name they earned. Rung was never simply a compliment to skilled soldiers, though the skill was entirely real and entirely earned. It was the only available word for something that had stopped behaving like an ordinary military threat and started behaving like an absence. A danger defined not by what it did, but by the complete impossibility of detecting it before it acted. You can prepare for an enemy who announces himself. You cannot fully prepare for one who does not, and the Viet Cong, patient and skilled trackers in their own right, understood this distinction better than anyone because they were the ones who kept failing to close it. And the deeper lesson here reaches past one small unit in one province of one war. The most feared force is very rarely the largest one. It is the one that has found a way to operate outside the enemy's ability to predict or detect it at all, because prediction and detection are the foundations every other form of defense is built on. Take those foundations away, and even a vastly larger and more powerful adversary is left fighting blind, unable to convert its overwhelming size into the one thing that actually wins engagements: knowing in advance where the danger is. Dossier spent 5 days chasing a patrol that had already vanished before he ever started looking, following a trail deliberately, expertly erased by men who understood that the truest weapon in that jungle was not a rifle at all. It was invisibility, patiently earned and used with total discipline against an enemy who had never had to face anything quite like it before. That is why the Viet Cong feared the Australian SAS more than any American unit in that war. Not because they killed more, because they could not be found in time to stop it. Now you know why they called them ghosts. Thank you for staying with the story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the quiet, disciplined patrols that shaped a war without ever needing to announce themselves on both sides of the wire. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, Australian, New Zealander, American, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.